In the summer of 1942, the German army felt like nothing could stop them. They had pushed deep into the Soviet Union, rolling over everything in their path for over a year. Their main goal now was simple: secure the rich oil fields in the faraway Caucasus region so the war machine could keep running. To do this, they needed to clean up the Volga River, and right on the Volga set a big, dirty, industrial city. This city wasn't special for any factory or weapon it made, but it had one massive problem: its name. It was called Stalingrad, and it was named after Joseph Stalin himself. So what started as a necessary military step quickly became a fight about pride, about who was stronger. Hitler wanted this city, not just for the river access, but to hurt Stalin personally. The army given this mission was the German Sixth Army, one of the best forces the Wehrmacht had, and it was led by General Friedrich Paulus. Paulus was known for being a very precise, very by-the-book commander. He expected a quick fight, a few weeks of pushing and clearing, and then he would move on. This was an army used to winning fast, and they saw the city as a prize they were already holding in their hands. But the moment they drove into the city, the fight changed. This was not the open land they were used to fighting in. Every single house, every burnt-out factory, and every pile of bricks became a small, bloody war. The Soviets would not give up the city. German soldiers started calling the fighting the Rats' War, because you weren't fighting big tank battles. You were crawling through tunnels and ruins, fighting for one room at a time. While Paulus's troops were locked inside this brutal, close-up fight, they forgot one thing: the big picture. They had pushed so far forward that their flanks, the left and right sides of their main force, were stretched thin and wide. These long lines were guarded not by the best German units, but mostly by Romanian and Italian forces who were not as well equipped or trained. This single massive error, putting their best army deep inside a city while leaving the sides wide open, was the mistake that would decide the fate of the entire war. While the Sixth Army was fighting and dying slowly inside the ruins of the city, the Soviet generals were watching. They saw the huge exposed weakness, the flanks held by Germany's weaker allies. This was their big chance. The Soviets spent weeks secretly moving hundreds of thousands of fresh, well-equipped soldiers into position, preparing a massive surprise attack. They called this plan Operation Uranus, and it was aimed straight at those thin spots. On November 19, 1942, the trap sprang open. The Soviet forces hit the northern and southern flanks with crushing force, punching through the Romanian lines quickly. The Romanians and Italian soldiers, who had poor anti-tank guns and had been fighting without proper winter gear, were simply overwhelmed. They broke and ran, abandoning their positions and leaving giant holes in the German defense line. These two massive Soviet forces, one from the north and one from the south, raced toward each other across the open steppe. Just 4 days later, on November 23, 1942, the leading Soviet tank units met near the town of Kalach. The circle was closed. Suddenly, the powerful German Sixth Army, around 300,000 men, was completely cut off from the rest of the German military. They were trapped inside a giant frozen pocket the Germans called the Kessel, or the cauldron. For General Paulus, this was the moment that decided everything. His army was trapped, but they still had tanks and fighting power. The only sensible thing to do was to immediately break out of the Kessel and connect with friendly forces before the Soviets could fully reinforce the ring. Many of his generals begged him to give the order to fight their way out right then, but Paulus was a man who only followed orders from the very top, and he feared Hitler's anger more than he feared the Soviet tanks. Paulus contacted the Führer for permission to leave the city, but the answer that came back was short, sharp, and deadly. Hitler, obsessed with the symbolic name of the city, gave a non-negotiable order: no retreat. He promised Paulus that the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, would supply the trapped men with everything they needed by air until they could be rescued. Paulus, deciding to obey the order of his leader instead of saving his men, chose to stay put. This single decision sealed the fate of the entire Sixth Army. With the no-retreat order given, the 300,000 men of the Sixth Army now depended entirely on a promise from the sky. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, promised Hitler that he could deliver 500 tons of supplies every single day to keep the trapped men alive. They needed that food, fuel, and ammunition to survive the Soviet winter, which was now settling in with a terrible cold. But the air supply was a failure from the very first day. The Luftwaffe, already weak and fighting in terrible weather, could only manage to fly in a tiny fraction of what was needed, sometimes less than 100 tons a day. The few planes that made it were often shot down by Soviet fighters or anti-aircraft fire. Because of this failure, the soldiers' rations quickly dropped. Men were soon eating horse meat, and later the daily food was just a thin, watery soup and maybe 100 grams of frozen bread. The Soviets knew the Germans were starving and freezing, so they waited. But they didn't stop putting pressure on the pocket. Day and night, the Soviet artillery constantly shelled the small area, which made finding shelter or even moving around extremely dangerous. The constant noise and the endless cold began to break the soldiers down mentally and physically. The men in the Kessel were running out of everything: ammunition, medicine, and hope. Desperate attempts were made by another German army, led by Field Marshal Manstein, to punch a path through the Soviet lines and rescue the Sixth Army. This effort, called Operation Winter Storm, got within 30 miles of the trapped soldiers. The Sixth Army men could hear the distant fighting, the noise of their rescuers trying to reach them, but Paulus, still obeying Hitler's order, did not move to meet them. He would not break the rules, even if it meant saving every man. By the end of January 1943, the situation was hopeless. The starving soldiers had been pushed into the ruins of the city center. On January 30th, 1943, Hitler sent one last strange message to Paulus. He promoted him to Field Marshal. This was an obvious hint because no German Field Marshal had ever been captured alive in history. The message was a clear order to commit suicide. But the next day, Field Marshal Paulus, sitting in a freezing basement, ignored the suggestion and sent a simple radio message to the Soviets. His army would surrender. When Field Marshal Paulus surrendered on February 2, 1943, the battle was finally over. The surrender was not just a small defeat, it was the biggest single catastrophe the German army had ever known. Around 91,000 German, Romanian, and Croat soldiers walked into Soviet captivity. But this was only a third of the men who had been trapped. The rest, more than 200,000, had already died from fighting, shelling, starvation, or disease in the frozen Kessel. For the soldiers who survived, the march into captivity was the start of an even longer nightmare. They were already severely weak, suffering from wounds, typhus, and terrible frostbite. Their bodies were barely holding up. Many of them died on the road during the march away from Stalingrad, too sick or too cold to keep walking. The Soviets did not have the resources or the desire to feed and house such a massive number of prisoners well. The living conditions in the camps were terrible. Sickness spread fast, and the lack of food meant men were dying every day. They were put to work building and repairing the very city they had just destroyed. The failure at Stalingrad broke the heart of the German war effort. Hitler ordered a 3-day national mourning period, something he rarely did. Most importantly, the Soviet victory shifted the entire momentum of the Eastern Front. After Stalingrad, the German army would never again launch a large-scale, decisive offensive deep into Soviet territory. From this point on, the war on the Eastern Front was a slow, bloody push by the Soviets toward Berlin.
Of the 91,000 German prisoners captured, only about 5,000 men ever saw Germany again. Most of them were kept in Soviet camps for years after the war, not being released until the mid-1950s. The city of Stalingrad was won back, but the cost was astronomical. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens and soldiers also died here. The story of the Sixth Army is not just about a lost battle. It is about the cold reality of total war, where arrogance and a refusal to retreat turned a strategic objective into an endless, frozen graveyard.